And so we now continue our whistle-stop tour around the world. We now travel to Asia. Food contact materials in Asia. What has changed there during the last 10 years? We're joined by Jorge. Is it Jorge? Jorge, yeah. Jorge Emmanuel. He's adjunct professor of environmental science and engineering at the Silliman University in the Philippines. Welcome, Jorge. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the Food Packaging Forum for this invitation. And I also like to thank Pele for wearing a necktie. Just a few days ago, I was in weather that's 30 degrees, so I do need the necktie. When Jane called me to talk about FCMs in Asia, my first reaction was, do you know how big Asia is? And so what I did is, in this slide, I just wanted to show you how the population of Asia is divided. We have 48 countries, more depending on what other countries you might consider part of Asia. And we're talking about 4.7 billion people. So China, the biggest, India, next to China, Indonesia is the third. And so what I've done is I've prepared some slides to give you just a rough idea of what's happening, very superficial, in these countries. So at least I'm covering a good part of the 4.7 billion people. But if I were to generalize what's been happening, to take Lizette's comment, many of the governments have been asleep on the wheel for a long time, and it's only been in the last 5 years, maybe 7 years, that many have finally taken notice of this issue. And so my slides are a bit text-heavy. I'm not going to go through each point. People can look at that at their leisure later, but I'll just use it to highlight some of the points. So let's start with the biggest, China. By the way, everything that's above the red line is before 10 years ago, and whatever's below is in the last 10 years. So China enacted a food safety law in 2009, but it wasn't until 2015 that they finally amended it, and they amended it several times since then. The 2015 amendment revised the framework somewhat into, instead of disparate regulations, they set up what they called horizontal standards, which I would call sort of like cross-cutting standards, the commodity standards, which some people also calling the vertical standards, which are based on actual food contact materials, and the set of standards having to do with test methods and then with good manufacturing practices. So 2015 was the main amendment. By 2016, China had 53 mandatory GB standards. GB is Gubiao, which just means national standards related to FCMs. I'm not going to go through the table, but as you can see, they've been adding to this, revising them. By 2019, the National Health Commission then announced plans to revise even more and enact some new ones. So a total of 81 food standards. And in the last number of years, they've been rapidly proposing and approving new FCMs or approving expanded scopes of existing substances. Now, so there's a plus and a minus to the whole story of Asia. There's now been an awakening, shall we say, in some of the governments. But the unfortunate part is some of the stuff that's being developed pick up from what's happening around the world. And in the case, say, of China, they've been proposing all these new materials. I noticed sometimes they'd give 1 month for public comment, sometimes 2 weeks. It's been quite rapid, and I am concerned at some of the ones that are being pushed through in their positive list. Let's go quickly to India. So India, before 10 years ago, had its Food Safety and Standards Act, and that's in 2006. And that's what created the main agency concerned, FSSAI, which is the Food and Standards Authority of India. And it wasn't until 2016 that they started looking at the problem. So in 2016, they began a study with the Indian Institute of Packaging. And what's interesting is that by the way, this was multisectoral. It had academics, it had consumer groups, it had academia, researchers, and so on. And they took samples from all throughout India, and every single sample failed to meet the Indian standards. And they found many cases of contamination due to substandard materials. They found packaging where colors were actually just seeping out. So by 2018, they finally announced some new regulations. They put in some overall migration level for their standards, what's used in many countries, 10 milligrams per decimeter squared or 60 milligrams per kilogram. They put in some specific requirements and intended uses. Then they put in some specific migration limits, but it was all mainly for metals. And they finally required manufacturers to have certificates of conformity. The latest version of these rules is 2022, which I haven't gotten a chance to look into deeper. Yes. So I just wanted to raise a few issues, for example. One of the things they did in the amendments is they finally said, these are the Indian standards that you have to follow. That's to alert people because of what they found in the study. The problem is many of those standards are quite old and many need upgrading. There's some issues on how things are defined. There's a problem Asia-wide. There are no labeling requirements, no traceability requirements. And as I said, the specific migration limits are only for metals so far. But I'd like to point out one recent issue, which I think is, shows how consumers and others are beginning to pay attention and put more pressure. The 2018 regulation banned the use of recycled plastics for food contact material. But in 2019, the FFSAI rescinded that ban and allowed recycled plastic to be used for FCMs. But there was quite a lot of pushback from academics, researchers, from consumer groups, so that by 2022, what India did, what the FSSAI did, is they actually issued some new, stricter regulations on how to use recycled plastic for food contact materials. So, for example, they said the conventional recycling of PET without removal of contaminants would not be allowed for use in FCMs. And then they specified processes which they said could be used for recycled, for the term they use, food-grade recycled PET. But they also required testing, a challenge test, an extraction test, a migration test, and they required manufacturers, recycling manufacturers, that are going to recycle PET for food-grade plastic to apply and register. So it was an attempt to put some more stringent regulations on recycled plastic. This is a concern for me, especially. I'm working in one whole arena of how to reduce plastic and plastic pollution, how to increase recycling. I don't believe recycling is a solution. At best, maybe an interim measure we can take. But nevertheless, there's been a lot of talk about using recycled plastics for food contact materials. But since I'm also looking in the area of food contact materials, I realize the problem that exists there, and sometimes we have to talk to our own environmental advocates to mention some of the problems that exist. So India tried to address that. Indonesia, the third largest country, is quite interesting. You can see they've had a number of regulations through the years, from 2004 to some regulations down to 2011, a key one. And they created the National Agency for Drug and Food Control, which is often in English written literature is referred to as NADFC. Actually, in Indonesia, Bahasa, it's actually called BPOM. But in 2014, in the last 10 years, they've amended this. They brought in the list of what are the FCMs. They created a negative list of prohibited substances, a positive list of substances divided between those with migration limit requirements and those without. They created new process to be able to approve new substances. And interestingly enough, they also included a regular sampling and analysis by inspectors. This was their idea of post-market vigilance. So that's Indonesia. And they've continued to proceed with improving or creating new standards under the Indonesian Standards Institute. And in 2019, they finally replaced the amendment that they had done earlier in 2014. And these are supposed to be a more stringent regulatory framework. They made this regulation compulsory in all types of food packaging. Manufacturers had to comply by 2020. They broadened the scope of the type of materials under their concern. And they continue with positive and negative lists. And of course, one of the things they did is they added more stringent requirements on using recycled plastic for food contact material, just as India has done. And they required good manufacturing processes for FMC manufacturers. Japan, although it's a much smaller country, has a lot of influence in the region. They've had laws dating back to 1947. What was disturbing about Japan, in 2003, they came up with a food safety basic law. But their idea was, we will ensure the safety of food contact materials, which, by the way, they refer to as food contact utensils, containers, and packaging, or some people just say UCPs. They did this by a combination of government regulations, which were very general, and by voluntary standards created by the trade associations themselves, like the associations that make PVC or polyvinylidene chloride, et cetera, et cetera. So the industry was basically creating their own standards. Interestingly enough, around 2016, again, only in the past 5-7 years for many of the countries in Asia, a committee was put together, the Committee on Regulation of Food UCPs, and they came up with a number of important findings. One is that substances that would not be allowed in the EU or the US could continue to be used in Japan. There was a big problem there. They also noted that many of the manufacturers were not members of the trade associations that had developed these voluntary standards, so they were outside the regulatory framework. They had no positive list, no mechanism for the sharing of information, no mechanism to have uniform good manufacturing practices. So in 2018, they finally came up with an amendment to the food sanitation law. They introduced a positive list. When you go through it, it's quite complicated, all sorts of complicated mixture rules and so on and so forth. They created a new paragraph in Article 3 of the old food sanitation law, which basically closed that gap. So if the substance is not in the positive list or there is no UCP standard that exists, then it cannot be used in Japan. They added some new articles. One was that the Ministry of Health, Labor and Welfare will come up with uniform standards for good manufacturing practices. And they put in a system so that information will now be shared by the food UCP manufacturers, by the food manufacturers, by the vendors, by the importers, because before that information was compartmentalized and it was very difficult for people to see if they were really compliant. In April of 2020, they came up with what they're calling the quantity that's unlikely to harm health, which they put at 0.01 milligrams per kilogram. And in June of 2020, they came up with their positive list with a 5-year grace period for unlisted items. And a few weeks ago, I understand, they announced that they're going to come up with an amended positive list, and they will begin to include some of the unlisted items and also a provisional list that the people would be able to see. Quickly on Thailand, before 10 years ago, they had this qualities and standards of containers of plastic dating back to 1988, modified in 2003. But since then, they had conducted a survey on food contact materials on the market and a survey also of the users. And so very recently, I'm talking this year, June of 2022, they came up with new requirements that are going to come into force beginning of next year. It's called Prescribed Quality of Standard of Plastic Containers. It expanded the scope, it updated a lot of the migration limits. The migration limits in 1998 were very, very high. They have a positive list with these updated migration limits. The Thai Food and Drug Administration must approve any new products. So there are all these stricter standards, including standards for the use of recycled plastics for food contact materials. And then they replaced what used to be voluntary standards of the Thai Industrial Standards Institute into mandatory standards. So that's moved forward. In my own country, my country had been asleep in the wheel for a very long time. In 2013, they came up with a Food Safety Act with hardly anything said about food contact materials. I've been trying to interact with the government, with the Food and Drug Administration. It's been extremely difficult. But just this year, they came up with guidelines on voluntary certification of food contact articles. So that's a step forward, but it's still leaves a lot to be desired. So I just want to talk about two specific challenges to give you an idea of what we are faced with. One is the issue of melamine tableware. If you go through many countries in Asia, melamine is everywhere. I recently moved to a new house. My wife and I said, maybe we need to buy some new dishes, some new plates. There are no more ceramic plates, no more glass, anything. It's all melamine. I was just completely stunned. In our stores, this is our local stores. In the bigger cities, you'd probably find a few more, but it's all over now. I'm not going to go through this. There are people here who have looked at this in more detail than I have, but we do know of the adverse effects of melamine, especially with cyanuric acid, both of which are often found together because it's a byproduct of the production of melamine and also a degradation product. I just mentioned the TDI. I noticed in 2008 the WHO TDI was a little higher than the US FDA TDI, but in terms of migration limits for melamine, the figure I saw was 0.2 milligrams per decimeter squared. There was a study done in Taiwan in 2016 that when they looked at actual potential exposures, they suggested that it need to be at least 0.07 milligrams per square decimeter. But these are the issues we have to deal with. But I want to point out that the sources of melamine for all of us is quite extensive. It's in adhesives, in flame retardants, it's in inks, in printed textiles and so on. And it's, with regards to food, it's in coatings of food packaging, coatings in some of the canned food material. And now we have melamine tableware, plates, bowls, and so on. A few months ago, an article came out in Chemosphere, which caught my attention. In the US, this is part of the ECHO program in the US. ECHO stands for Environmental Influences on Child Health Outcomes, involving tens of thousands of children. More than 60% of pregnant mothers that were tested in the US had melamine or cyanuric acid and other aromatic amines in their urine. That's quite shocking. And it was especially bad among Hispanic and Black mothers who were pregnant. So imagine a common scenario in Asia where you have melamine all over the place. I go to a store, everything's in melamine. We have a lot of Asian foods that are very acidic. A lower pH means higher melamine migration. We have a lot of hot soups that are quite acidic. Very common today in Asia. In the Philippines, you come in a food stall, they'll actually microwave your soup in the melamine bowl and give it to you to drink. Shocking to me. So then you have the issue of having other chemicals leaching out from the bowls and multiple exposures. So how then do we protect public health? I've been seeing all these papers that have come out about how they've done migration studies and they then extrapolate it to, say, orange juice, and it's not a problem, it's an order of magnitude, et cetera, et cetera. But think of the exposure where we have these multiple exposures to mixtures of materials, and other sources of melamine in our bodies. And so that's a challenge for those of us trying to protect public health and using one piece of laboratory data to say, this is the safe limit. So these are the challenges we face. One last example I give is sachets. When I talk about sachets, I don't mean sachets like in tea bag sachets or oxygen scavenging sachets that you put in food or to remove moisture. I'm talking about sachets about this size, could be small, could be large, where you have all sorts of foods in them. So there are wet foods. You can buy soy sauce in sachets, cooking oil in sachets, etc., dry foods in sachets, and even a lot of personal care products, shampoos, etc., and household items. Now, some people mentioned the Jambeck study, for example, and out of the Jambeck study came this narrative, especially from a lot of multinational corporations, sort of putting the blame on these Asian peoples who are responsible for all the plastics in our ocean, because the Philippines, Indonesia, a number of Asian countries were high in the rank of supposedly leakage of plastics. So I'll tell you the story of sachets to change this narrative a bit. Growing up in the 1950s, I remember, by the way, in the Philippines, we have 1.3 million neighborhood stores. They're small stores owned by usually middle class or lower middle class. And you can go take a little bit of walk and you'll see these neighborhood stores. So there used to be an active reuse and refill system in the Philippines. I remember my mother would say, she'd wash a glass and say, go to the sari-sari store, buy some cooking oil, and there was a way we'd determine how many scoops and all that, and we'd pay for it. And this was the way it was for decades and decades. And of course, we'll take it all back in what we call bayongs, which are woven baskets, very common, a very sustainable practice. In the 1960s and 70s, the multinational companies decided it's time for us to capture this big market, because this was important, especially for the poor people who couldn't afford to buy a big container of cooking oil, for example. So you sell it to you in small containers that you bring. Well, they replaced that with a sachet economy. So you can go to many places, like you see in the picture at the top right, where a typical neighborhood store would have these long things of sachets that they would cut and sell it to the public and put it in single-use plastic bags to take home. It completely destroyed a sustainable practice. So I'd like to change the narrative by saying it's not really the Filipinos or Indonesians who are the cause of all this plastic pollution. In reality, many of the poor people have no options because this is what they can afford. And the irony is that when we looked at some of the costs, you can save more money if you buy things in larger containers, but the poor people can afford it, so they're making money out of these, out of the poor with the sachet economy. The sad thing is that it has caused a huge problem. These sachets are typically vacuum metallized polyethylene terephthalate with an LDPE layer, all these with a lot of adhesives. I've been very concerned about the migration of adhesives and other problems into the food. Filipinos today use 164 million pieces of sachet every day. That's a mistake. Yes, every day. So every day, that's how much is being sold by these neighborhood stores. We recently did a study, 60 billion sachets discarded now into environment, as you can see in the picture of the lower bottom. They're all over environment, our rivers and so on. And this amounts to about 452,000 tons of residual waste. And a lot of this turns into microplastics, of course, eventually, and goes into our food, which is another area of research I'm doing. This is my last slide, and I put food packaging form at the bottom to remind myself that, as I said, I've been working with the Food and Drug Administration. It's been very difficult for them to even pay attention. This year, for the first time, I've gotten their attention. In fact, last Friday, they would meet me in a 3-hour video conference. And for the first time, I feel we were able to move the needle a little bit about the issue of sachets, because I raised the issue. I said, you're the Food and Drug Administration. Here's the impact on food safety. And I must say, in the last number of months, I've been sending a lot of links to Food and Packaging Forum material, to your fact sheets, to your dossiers, and so on. And I really think it's beginning to get them to think about this for the first time. And maybe that's the reason they finally came up with, quote, voluntary certification, but that's a first step. So I think it'll be appropriate for me to end my presentation with a shout out to Food Packaging Forum that the work you're doing not only affects, obviously, Switzerland and Europe, but has a big effect on us trying to move our governments in Asia, where governments have been asleep on the wheel for a long time, but hopefully now will begin to take action. And while they're using a lot of models from Europe and the United States, they'll also begin to look at what are the problems with the existing international regulations and hopefully begin to deal with this issue. So I'd like to thank Jane and the Food Packaging Forum for all the wonderful material. You've made it much easier for those of us working on the ground. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.